Hello, everyone, and I hope you're having a fantastic week so far. So, earlier in the semester, we learned about the blur and sharpen tools in Photoshop, tools that allow us to blur images or enhance the visible edges of objects within images. While those tools are incredibly useful for blurring and sharpening small areas with brushes, when you want to affect a selection or an entire image or layer, the blur and sharpen filters are the tool to use. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use the various blur filters in Photoshop and some applications for their use. First, we will be downloading our example photos for this lesson. Vibrant pink dahlia flower, which the base images in this document are by Sergey Anatov and Irina Iriser. And then we also want to download Vintage Blue Train by Marcin Monka. Open up only Vibrant Pink Dahlia Flower to begin with in Photoshop. So, Photoshop blur filters are designed primarily for retouching images to soften, haze, cloud, fuzz, or distort specific areas of a picture or the entire image. Backgrounds are often blurred out to accentuate the main subject of a photo or to reduce clutter in the environment. Blur filters also collect, then fuse the colors in a selected area to create a specific effect, such as motion. To find the various blur filters, navigate to Filter in the top menu bar and then hover over Blur about midway down through the list. There are currently 11 different blur filters outside of the blur gallery. First, we have Average, which works by Photoshop considering all of the colors in a selected area, then calculating the average color of the combined hues, and then fills the area with that color. Then we have Blur, which is your basic blur filter. This softens all the pixels in the selection or image. It can be pretty subtle, so you may have to use this multiple times to achieve a proper blurring effect, especially for higher resolution images. Then we have Blur More, which is exactly the same as Blur, but it's increased by 4 times the effect. Still, despite being 4 times as strong, this filter can still appear to be a rather subtle effect, especially again for higher resolution images. Then we have Box Blur, which finds the edges of objects in an image, then averages the colors of pixels adjacent to the target objects to create a blur effect. I admit I don't really use this one as much. Next, we have Gaussian Blur. This is my go-to blurring tool. Unlike Blur and Blur More, this filter allows you greater control over the amount of blur you apply to your image by increasing or decreasing the radius slider in the dialog box. Next, we have Lens Blur. This powerful filter provides 14 levels of adjustable effects, including 6 shapes and several depth map selections. You'll have greater control over the final results of your image because you can fine-tune so many effects. This filter can create somewhat realistic camera focus effects which cannot be achieved by other blur filters. Next, we have Motion Blur, which blurs the image from one point to another, creating an illusion of motion. Then we have Radial Blur, which blurs the image in a circular way. With this filter, you can adjust the amount of blurring, the method, such as around circular lines or a zooming effect, and the quality, and the option to set the blur center in different spots in your canvas. Next, we have Shape Blur, which blurs the image based on the selected shape. If you're familiar with cameras, this works vaguely similar to placing a shape cutout in front of your lens, giving the lens focus that sort of shape. Next, we have Smart Blur. This filter uses meticulously accuracy based on dissimilar pixels, which includes specifying a radius or area size, which is 0.1 to 100, choosing a threshold with the same range, and selecting a blur quality and the blur mode. The modes include normal for the whole image, edge only, and overlay edge for color transitions such as black and white images or white only, respectively, to blur images. This one can achieve great results, but it honestly often slows down my computer, so I tend not to use this one a lot. Lastly, we have Surface Blur, which maintains object edges while reducing and smoothing out the noise or graininess. The radius determines the area size, while threshold determines how much they must deviate in color in order to be included in the blur effect. So let's talk about the blur gallery next. When you select any of the options underneath blur gallery, which they are field blur, iris blur, tilt shift, path blur, and spin blur, Photoshop will open the blur gallery workspace. While within the workspace, you can control which of these blurs and how many of them are active by selecting the check marks in the right-hand blur tools panel. You can also expand and hide the options of each tool by clicking on the small arrow to the left of each blur name. Each blur tool will affect your preview pane in different ways. Often, these are to show you where your focal point is, such as in iris blur, or the direction of the blur, such as in path blur. Each of these options in the blur gallery roughly corresponds to an option in the basic blur filters above, but their increased options allow you to better control their effects. One notable use of the blur gallery that cannot be achieved easily through standard blur filters is the tilt shift blur filter. Tilt shift is an interesting photographic technique that uses selective blurs to create a sort of miniaturization effect in a photograph. To best illustrate this effect, now we can open Vintage Blue Train in a new tab in Photoshop. Once you have Vintage Blue Train open in Photoshop, navigate to Filter and then select Blur Gallery and then Tilt Shift. You'll see in the preview window there are 4 lines in a central circle. These 4 lines determine where the blur starts and stops, and the central circle is our central focal point. As we move the focal point, the blur lines follow along. You can change the rotation of the blur by hovering over the white anchor points on the blue lines until your mouse changes to the rotation icon. Additionally, you can change the size of the blur space by hovering your mouse over anywhere on the blur line aside from the white anchor point. By increasing the blur amount and moving the focal point on to the blue train engine, we can see that the scene starts to look a little bit less like a full-size train and more like a miniature one. This can be a fun effect to mess with. I'll link further information about tilt shift photography in the supplemental materials in Canvas. Now, with our newfound knowledge of the various blur filters, let's navigate back to our Pink Dahlia flower document. You'll notice that this photo has been broken up into 3 main layers: a foreground of some leaves in the bottom left corner, the flower, and then the background foliage. Using whatever blur filters you think will work best, blur the foreground layer and the background layer to create a better focus on the central flower. Feel free to blur the flower creatively as well if you think it will add to the effect. I personally enjoyed using surface blur on the flower to create this smooth, silky sort of effect on it. Once you're done creating your composite, submit a link to it in Canvas and you're done. I hope that feels like you've learned a lot about the blur filters. If you want to know more or you need more information, feel free to message me on Canvas. And until next time, I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you at the next lesson. Bye-bye.